Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to drift gently into the past, to a quiet little village nestled among soft, wooded hills, where wildflowers bloom in the meadows and church bells echo faintly through the morning mist. There, I live a life of peace and slowness, in a small thatched cottage surrounded by herbs, warmth, and the hum of gentle days. This story isn't about great battles or famous names. It's about the simple rhythm of living, the kind that wraps around your heart like a worn quilt or a familiar scent. It's meant to calm you, to soothe your thoughts and invite sleep with every word. So, let yourself relax. Take a slow breath, if you like, close your eyes, and imagine stepping barefoot onto a dew-damp path beneath a soft sky, with birds in the distance and the scent of thyme in the air. Stay with me to discover the gentle secrets history left behind. And if you enjoy this story, please like and subscribe for more hidden moments from the past. We truly appreciate your support. Each morning, I wake to the soft cooing of doves just beyond the shutters and the slow stretch of sunlight sliding across the wooden floor. I rise before the sun is fully up, when the mist still clings low to the fields, and the world remains hushed in its sleep. The first breath I take is always cool, tinged with damp earth and the faintest hint of wild thyme. My slippers sit patiently beside the bed, worn leather, lined with wool. They know the shape of my feet well by now. I wrap my shawl around my shoulders, tie my apron at my waist, and step outside into the hush of early light. The chill greets me kindly, brushing against my cheeks like a whisper. The path to my cottage curves gently, lined with smooth stones softened by the years. Even in early light, the dew makes them glisten as if kissed by stars. Birds call sleepily in the trees, their voices still hushed, like lullabies not yet finished. I know each of their songs, and I greet them as I walk, just as I do the elderflower bush at the turn, the mossy log where the rabbits nest, and the creaky wooden gate I never quite get around to fixing. My cottage always appears in pieces. First, the stone chimney pokes above the grass, then the sloped roof, dark with dew, and finally, the ivy-covered walls, green and curled like lace. Smoke rises faintly from the chimney. Though I haven't yet lit the fire, it's just the embers, still dreaming beneath the ash from last night's warmth. The door opens with a familiar creak. I never oil the hinges. I like the sound. It's part of home. Inside, the air is still not cold, not warm, just quiet, just mine. Shelves line the walls, filled with jars of dried herbs, bundles of twine, beeswax candles, and scrolls of yellowed parchment. A single beeswax candle waits on the table. I light it slowly, letting the soft glow stretch across the room like a breath. Tea comes next, always nettle, chamomile, and a pinch of lemon balm. I prefer fresh leaves when the garden allows, but even dried, they carry the memory of sunlight and summer soil. The kettle hangs above the hearth, its bottom darkened from 1,000 fires. I sit near it, listening to the wood pop softly beneath the iron, letting the warmth rise and settle in my bones. Sometimes I write in the mornings, notes in the margins of my old journals, sketches of plants I've gathered or dreams I can barely remember. The pages are thick and uneven, stitched by hand, and smudged with ink and pressed petals. Some hold bits of laughter, written sideways in the corners. Some carry quiet tears. When the sun begins to stretch more boldly across the sky, I unlatch the shutters and let the light pour in. It spills across the table, climbs the walls, and dances on the floorboards. There's a peace in watching morning settle into its rhythm. Before the day truly begins, I take one more walk around the edge of my garden. My fingers brush across rosemary, sage, lavender. Each plant, to me, is more than useful. They are old friends. They listen. They grow beside me. I notice which ones need water, which ones lean toward the sun, which have bloomed silently in the night. Finally, I settle on the old stone step just outside the door, the same step I've sat on since I was a child. I cradle my cup, now warm in my hands, and sip the herbal tea as the steam curls gently into the morning air. There's no rush. The village will wake in time. For now, I sit, breathe, and let the path of my life guide me to stillness once more. There's a special hush in my garden just after dawn, the kind of quiet that feels alive, as if the plants are listening to the world wake up, taking in every sigh of wind and every distant chirp. I step outside with my second cup of tea, still warm in my hands, and the garden greets me like it always does, with the scent of mint, the rustle of leaves, and a peacefulness that settles around my shoulders like a shawl. The soil is still dark with dew, and I kneel carefully by the rosemary first. Its needles are sharp and fragrant, a smell that always reminds me of early autumn and roast vegetables from my childhood. I run my fingers gently along its stems, checking for signs of new growth. It's healthy, as always strong and sturdy, like an old uncle who doesn't say much. Each plant in my garden has its own rhythm. The chamomile is sleepy, soft, always bending with the breeze as though it's nodding off again. The sage grows slow and wise, with broad leaves that shimmer silver in the right light. I've always thought it looks like moonlight made in two. I work my way around the garden in slow loops, barefoot now, because I like the way the earth feels under my feet. There's something grounding about cool dirt in the morning, like a reminder that everything begins here, in the roots. I speak to the plants as I go, not in sentences, always, but in murmurs and hums, and sometimes a quiet little song I hum without realizing it. They don't need words. Really? They know me. By the trellis, the time has begun to climb again. Tiny blossoms, barely open, already scenting the air with that dry, warm aroma that lingers even on my fingers. I clip a few sprigs to dry later. They'll go in a tea for a neighbor's cough, or maybe into a stew, depending on the week. There's a corner of the garden I tend most gently where the lemon balm and violet grow side by side, under the shade of an old wooden fence. That's where the bees always gather. I leave a shallow dish of water there, lined with stones so they can perch. It's the quietest part of the garden. When I sit there, I can hear the soft drone of their wings, the creak of a branch, the shifting hush of tall grass leaning in the wind. Nothing loud, nothing rushed, just the kind of quiet that makes you feel held. I never rush the garden. I never take more than I need. I trim what's overgrown. I pick only what will regrow stronger, and I whisper thanks under my breath without even thinking about it. It's not superstition. It's respect. This garden is a companion, not a tool. It has seen my tears and my laughter, and it has grown through them all. There's a small stone bench beneath the elder tree. Its roots twist above the ground like old hands, and its trunk leans ever so slightly to the east, as if bowing toward the rising sun. I sit there for a while every morning, letting my tea cool slowly as I take in the garden from a distance. From here, I can see the patches of color green parsley, yellow yarrow, purple lavender, and the gentle movement of everything that grows and breathes. Sometimes I close my eyes and just listen. There are so many sounds when you're still: the flutter of wings in the lavender, the tiny patter of a rabbit bounding across the far edge of the grass, the rustle of a bird taking off from the roof, even the soft snap of a stem being bent by a snail. I always feel more myself here, in the middle of the green. It reminds me that life can grow in silence, that healing doesn't always look like loud joy or grand transformation. Sometimes it's just new leaves on an old plant. Sometimes it's just breathing in and out with no need to move quickly or explain anything at all. The last thing I do before returning inside is harvest a few things for the day. Calendula petals bright and golden like tiny suns go into a small woven basket. A pinch of peppermint for a tincture, some fennel seeds for a tea. I promised an old friend I carry them in gently, like carrying pieces of the morning light itself. Back inside, I spread them on parchment to dry or prepare them for use. My hands move in practiced motions, but my mind stays outside, among the leaves and breeze. That stillness clings to me, even in the quiet of my kitchen, as if the garden itself wrapped around my shoulders and followed me home. I wasn't always fluent in the language of plants. It's a quiet tongue, one you don't learn from books or lessons, but from long hours of simply watching and waiting. As a girl, I spent more time crouched beside ditches and hedgerows than I did inside. My hands were always stained green by midday. I would press petals between the pages of my father's old ledgers and scribble notes in the margins how they smelled, where they grew, what the bees seemed to love best. It was my mother who first told me that the leaves speak, though not with voices. She'd pluck a sprig of something and say, "Look how it leans toward the sun, how it droops when it's had too much water." She taught me to see what others overlook, the slight curl at the edge of a sick leaf, the way petals close just before rain, the thin red line that runs through a healthy stalk like a pulse. Now, when I walk through the woods or crouch in my garden, I see these signs everywhere. I don't need to think, I simply notice. A plant will tell you if it's cold, if it's lonely, if it's been disturbed. Sometimes they tell you things you didn't know you needed to hear, like a hush when your mind is too noisy, or a sudden sweetness in the air when you've been carrying sorrow too long. I remember one morning, years ago, I found a patch of St. John's wort blooming bright and golden beneath the brambles. I'd passed that path a dozen times and never seen it before, but that day, it was there as if it had always waited until I needed it most. I sat beside it, not picking, just listening. I was feeling lost then, tired in a way that sleep couldn't mend. The flowers didn't fix it, not exactly, but they stayed with me. That golden light nestled in my chest and stayed, even on the grayest days. There are plants that soothe, and plants that warn. Yarrow grows near places that once held pain. It's a healer, but it doesn't bloom without a story beneath the soil. Mugwort whispers in dreams. Willow knows grief and carries it gently in its bark. And then there are the quiet plants, those that don't clamor for attention, but sit patiently until someone sees them. Like chickweed, soft as a sigh, or wood sorrel, hiding Over time, I began to match what I felt in myself to what I found in the forest. When I was restless, I'd seek lemon balm. When heavy with thought, I'd brew tea with blue vervain. Each leaf became a mirror, and each petal a hand stretched toward me, offering something wordless but whole. Some days, I take a long walk into the woods behind the cottage. The trail isn't marked. It weaves naturally, winding around fallen logs and moss-covered stones. I bring my satchel, empty but for linen cloth and a dull-bladed knife, and I let my steps be slow and open. I don't decide what I'm looking for. I wait to be shown. A patch of violets might call me over, or the faint shimmer of dew on a fern might catch my eye. I touch before I take, I thank before I leave. It's a relationship, not a harvest. These plants aren't mine. They are neighbors, and I treat them with the kind of reverence most people reserve for sacred things. Back home, I record everything. Not in a scientific way, though. I suppose it is a kind of science, passed through hands instead of institutions. My journals are filled with pressed leaves, rough sketches, and little stories found near River's Bend. Sweet scent. Ants nearby, or blossomed one day after thunderstorm. Energy sharp, not unfriendly. When I make teas or tinctures, I remember these notes, not just what a plant does, but who it is, how it felt when I found it, what it might offer someone else, if given with care. Healing isn't always about fixing. Sometimes it's about witnessing, being seen by a leaf, a petal, a gentle green thing that expects nothing but presence. Evenings are often spent in quiet reflection, surrounded by the day's gatherings. The scent of drying herbs fills the cottage earthy, sweet, a little wild. I sit at the table and sort leaves into little piles, letting my fingers memorize their shapes again. The candlelight makes shadows dance across the parchment, and I feel held, somehow, by the rhythm of it all. I don't always know if others would understand this language. It's not taught, it's remembered, somehow maybe carried in our bones from times when we lived closer to the land. But when I offer a tea or a salve, and someone takes it with both hands, smiling softly, I know the plant's message has been heard, not in words, in warmth, in stillness, in the quiet way we all long to be cared for. There's a box on the shelf above my hearth, tucked behind a jar of rose hips and an old brass candlestick. It isn't much to look at plain wood, worn smooth at the corners, its latch slightly bent and long unused, but it holds the weight of memory. It was my mother's, and before that, her mother's, passed not with ceremony, but with quiet understanding like a torch held out in the dark. I remember the first time I was allowed to open it. I was still small enough to sit on her lap, my legs dangling over the side of her chair. Her hands smelled like lavender and soap. She set the box between us, lifted the lid with a creak, and said, "These are things that remember." I didn't know what she meant then, but I do now. Inside were bundles of dried herbs wrapped in linen, tied with thread that had faded from bright reds and greens to soft rose and moss. Each bundle had a tiny tag, her looping script naming not just the plant, but the time and place. Chamomile, midsummer, near the orchard. Yarrow, first frost, by the stream. She always wrote the season, never the year, because she believed the season told you everything. There were notes, too, folded slips of paper tucked between the bundles like secrets. Some were recipes, some were just thoughts. Time for restless nights. A smile returned today gave her marigold tea. As a child, I didn't always understand them, but I read them anyway, slowly, reverently, as if the meaning might rise off the page like steam. And tucked in the back corner, always the little cloth pouch of marbles. They weren't herbs. They weren't even useful. Just smooth glass, colored like sea and fire and honey. For remembering joy, she said, she kept them from when she was a child. I never saw her play with them, but I saw her hold them when she was tired. Over the years, I added to the box, not often, not carelessly, a dried sprig of meadow sweet from the day I first gathered herbs on my own, a feather from the red kite that used to circle the cottage every spring, a scrap of blue ribbon from the first tincture I sold in the village, wrapped lovingly by the midwife who'd asked for it. Some people collect coins, others letters or photographs. My mother collected quiet, moments pressed into plants, folded into paper, kept safe for when the world moved too quickly. I do the same now, not just for me, but for those who come to me seeking comfort. Sometimes, a neighbor will visit, voice hushed, eyes heavy, unsure of what they need. I listen. Then, when they've finished, I stand, walk to the hearth, and take down the wooden box. I open it gently, as if I might wake something inside. And I look not for the newest herbs, but for something old, something remembered, a balm passed down, maybe, a little cloth with the right scent, or simply a line from a note written years ago, now meant for today. The box never fails me. On quiet nights, I sit beside it with a candle lit low, the flame flickering just enough to cast shadows on the lid. I take everything out slowly, touching each piece like an old friend's hand. The lavender is more brittle now. The ink on some tags is faded, but the memory remains, not just of the plants or the notes, but of my mother's voice, her hands, her warmth. She's been gone many years, yet in these moments, she's with me, not in ghost or dream, but in the quiet knowledge she left behind, in the rosemary she dried with care, in the linen she stitched, in the rhythm of how she tucked it all away. I think that's what healing is, sometimes, not fixing what's broken, but finding the thread that connects us back to someone who showed us how to live gently, how to hold memory in our hands like something fragile and beautiful, how to listen without rushing, how to offer without needing thanks. The wooden box is never locked. It never was. But still, no one opens it but me, not out of secrecy, but respect. Like how one doesn't step into a circle of mushrooms without asking, or sing in a chapel without lowering the voice. It is, in its own way, sacred. In the evening, when the sky turns from soft blue to the dusky lavender of twilight, there's a particular corner of my cottage that calls to me. It's the one just left of the hearth, where the stone curves inward slightly and the floor creaks in a comforting, familiar way when I settle there. It's not a grand space, just a stool, a small wooden table, and a row of shelves above, filled with the jars and bottles I reach for the most. But to me, it's the heart of the home. By this time of day, the light has grown gentle. Outside, the trees sway lazily, their shadows stretching across the garden path like sleeping cats. Inside, I light the candle on the table, a fat, beeswax candle that burns slow and sweet, giving off the faintest scent of honey and warmth. The flame flickers and throws golden light against the stone, and suddenly, the whole space feels as if it's breathing. This is where I work, but work doesn't feel like the right word. It's more like tending, or offering, or remembering. The table holds a marble mortar and pestle, a pair of tiny silver scissors, and a little cloth pouch filled with dried chamomile. Everything is worn, softened by time, touched daily, and with care. Tonight, I make a sleep salve, something simple and soothing. I melt a bit of beeswax in a small clay bowl over the hearth. It softens slowly, like snow in warm hands. I stir in infused oils, lavender and calendula, steeped for weeks in sunlight and turn gently each day. The scent rises up, wrapping itself around me like a lullaby. I take my time, mixing until the texture is smooth and the scent balanced. Not too sharp, never too strong, just enough to comfort. On the shelf above, tiny glass jars catch the candlelight like stars. Each one holds something different: dried lemon balm, crumbled rose petals, powdered slippery elm. Their labels are handwritten in ink that sometimes smudges if I'm not careful. I like it that way. Nothing too neat, nothing pretending to be more than it is. Sometimes, I pause and hold a jar in my hands not because I need it, but because touching it feels like greeting a memory. I think of the days I gathered those herbs, of the sun on my back, the wind brushing my face, the sound of birdsong overhead. Each blend holds a story, not written, but remembered in scent, in texture, in the way my fingers move when I make it again. I always keep a small piece of cloth on the table, a square of soft linen I've had for years. It's there to dab spills, to wrap small bundles, or simply to rest my hands on when I pause. Tonight, I use it to cover the finished jar of salve, tying it with a bit of twine before placing it near the hearth to cool. I'll bring it to the widow down the lane tomorrow. She's been having trouble sleeping again, and I promised I'd make something for her. The candle burns lower now, its flame dipping and dancing. Outside, an owl calls once, softly. I close my eyes and let the sound wash over me. The world slows in this light, and so do I. There is no hurry, nothing demands. The day has offered all it needed to, and now it folds gently into night. I sit with my hands in my lap, still scented with lavender and beeswax. The stone wall behind me is cool, grounding. I lean into it slightly, feeling its steadiness. The house sighs around me, the soft groan of the wooden beams overhead, the rustle of wind through the shutters, the fading crackle of the fire. Sometimes I think this corner holds more memory than anywhere else. It has watched me through grief and joy, through questions and quiet revelations. It has held my stillness and my small laughter. When I sit here, I feel like I'm part of something older than myself, something that continues quietly, whether anyone sees it or not. I stay until the candle is just a puddle of golden wax. the wick curling into itself like a sleeping cat. Then I rise slowly, brushing my hands on my apron, and blow it out with a soft breath. Darkness folds in, gentle and unhurried, and I move through it with ease. I leave the corner as it is jars lined in a row, tools resting, the faintest trail of lavender still hanging in the air. It will wait for me, like it always has, like it always will. Some mornings, just as the mist begins to lift from the fields, I hear the faint creak of the gate down the path. It's not loud just enough to rise above the bird song and the rustle of wind in the ivy. I always pause when I hear it, not with alarm, but with curiosity and a kind of quiet joy. Visitors come often, though never in crowds. My gate doesn't swing wide for gatherings or noise. It opens for the gentle souls who make their way up the path slowly, perhaps pausing to admire the rose hips by the fence or to gather a pebble from the stream bed that crosses the lane. They come with baskets and questions, with stories and aching hearts. They come for tea, for tinctures, for comfort they can't always name. This morning, it was Tom, the shepherd, who appeared at my gate, his hat in his hand and a thoughtful frown on his brow. I waved him in, and we sat beneath the arbor, where the climbing roses have begun to bud again. He didn't need words right away. Few people do. I brewed us a tea of lemon balm and wild mint while he looked out over the garden, silent. When he finally spoke, it was only to say, "They're not sleeping well. The lambs." I nodded, poured the tea, and we sat together, watching the steam curl into the morning light. I gave him a little sachet lavender, oats, a pinch of valerian root to tuck into their pen. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's the act of caring that brings the rest. Later in the week, it was Elsie and her grandson, little Leo. He's all knees and questions, always darting around the garden, his laughter a welcome breeze. Elsie comes for calendula balm for her hands, cracked from years of bread kneading and dishwashing and the kind of work that never complains. Leo, of course, wants something too, anything in a jar. I let him choose a pebble from the stream and place it in a tiny bottle. He carries it like treasure. People don't come for miracles. They come for gentleness, for the sense that someone is listening not just to their words, but to the pauses between them. I listen with my hands, with the kettle, with the herbs I choose. Sometimes, I sit in silence with them while the tea steeps, letting the quiet stretch without apology. Not all visitors are people. Birds land near my window ledge and peer inside, heads tilted as if asking what I'm working on. A red fox pads by some evenings, her coat shining like fire in the dusk. And once, in the middle of a rainstorm, a hedgehog wandered into the kitchen, soaked and blinking. I laid out a cloth and let him rest by the stove. He was gone by morning, but the smell of wet leaves lingered, a reminder of his quiet visit. Animals know where kindness lives. They don't ask for it with words. They sense it, like warmth, like shelter. I've long believed they remember places, not by sight, but by feeling. My cottage must carry some memory of comfort. I hope it always does. Some visitors stay longer an afternoon, perhaps lost in stories beside the fire. Others linger just a moment, placing a gift on the step, a handful of wild flowers, a basket of eggs, a note tied with twine. These small exchanges mean more than gold. They are acts of neighborliness, of trust. There's a rhythm to it, a dance of arrivals and departures. I never know who will come next, and yet I always feel ready. Not because I plan, but because I leave space. Space on the shelf, in the kettle, in my heart. I never try to solve too much. I only offer what I can, a warm drink, a listening ear, a bit of something green and growing. As the sun sinks behind the distant ridge, I often find myself looking down the path, toward the gate, not in longing, just in quiet attention. It swings gently sometimes with the breeze, creaking like an old friend clearing its throat. And even when no one comes, the act of waiting feels whole, because in this life, Healing isn't always about answers. It's about presence. It's about being the place people think of when they don't know where else to go. It's about a gate that never locks and a door that opens slowly, with love. There's nothing quite like the sound of rain on a thatched roof. It's softer than on tile or tin, less of a drum beat, more of a lullaby. Each drop seems to land with care, soaking into the tightly packed straw and sending the faintest hush through the air, like nature exhaling. On rainy days, I rarely leave the cottage. I don't need to. The world folds in close, wrapping me in its misty quiet, and I welcome it like an old friend at the door. This morning, the clouds had already begun their slow stretch across the sky by the time I lit the fire. A low breeze carried the scent of rain long before the first drops fell. I love that smell, petrichor, some call it, but I think of it simply as the smell of the earth stretching its arms after a long thirst. The leaves outside shimmered slightly, and the birds grew quiet, settling into their nests as if they, too, were preparing to stay in for a while. By midday, the rain had come steady and true. I moved slowly through the cottage, lighting a few candles even though the hour was still early. Their glow added a softness to the walls, warming the gray light that filtered in through the windows. I brewed a strong tea mullein and honey, with a splash of milk, and wrapped myself in the green shawl I keep draped over the rocking chair. Its edges are frayed from years of use, and I wouldn't trade it for the finest wool. The rhythm of the rain became my companion. Tap, 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 pause, tap. It lulled me into quiet tasks. I shelled dried peas into a bowl, the soft clatter of them falling, matching the gentle percussion from above. I organized the herb jars, realigning them by season, by scent, by memory. Some days, it doesn't matter how they're ordered. It's the act of touching them that soothes me. At one point, I noticed the fire had grown low. I added a log, and it hissed slightly from the damp air clinging to it. The flames caught slowly, stretching like sleepy arms toward the chimney, the scent of wood smoke mixed with lavender and the fresh rain. It was, in a way, perfect. I've always found that rain slows time. It doesn't stop it, not quite, but it makes each moment fuller, deeper, like a well filling quietly beneath the surface. I often find myself drifting into thought on days like these. Not worry, not planning, just the kind of gentle wandering the mind does when given space. Sometimes I sit by the window and watch the rivulets trail down the glass. I trace them with my finger, letting their paths decide where my eyes go next. Outside, the garden looks different under rain. The colors deepen. The green becomes richer, almost blue. The flowers bow under the weight of water, not in defeat, but in grace. Today, I caught sight of the cat, black and sleek, curled up beneath the bench just outside the door. Dry, somehow, despite the downpour. She blinked slowly at me, then tucked her head beneath her paw. Unconcerned, I smiled and returned to my chair, the rocking one near the hearth. It creaks softly as I move, not unpleasantly, just enough to remind me it's alive in its own way. There are tasks I save for rainy days, mending a torn apron, rolling new beeswax candles, reading old notes my mother left in the margins of her journals. One simply read, "Rain means rest." I never asked her what she meant, but I understood it. Rain is permission to be still. In the afternoon, I lit the oil lamp on the table and sat to write. Not anything particular, just thoughts. What I'd noticed in the garden the day before, how the calendula seemed to bloom more brightly after a storm, how the damp in the air made the lavender scent stronger. I write as I live slowly, with care, and without expectation that anyone but me will read it. Later, I prepared a broth onions, carrots, parsley, and a bit of barley. It simmered quietly as I worked, its scent winding through the cottage like a soft song. I always make extra on rainy days. Someone might stop by, soaked and cold, and it's good to have something warm ready. But no one came today, and that was all right too. As evening settled in and the rain continued its steady rhythm, I sat once more by the fire. I held my tea, now cool, and listened, not to words, just to the roof above me, holding back the sky, just to the way the wind moved through the chimney, humming gently, just to the sigh of the house as it settled around me like a blanket. I think we all need days like this when the world slows, when no answers are needed, when simply listening becomes enough. The rain teaches us that. So does the roof, the fire, the quiet cup in your hand. I let the light fade. I let the sounds become softer. I let the stillness carry me. He arrived just as the sun was lowering behind the hill, casting a pale golden light across the tops of the trees. I remember it well, not because of who he was, but because of how quietly he came. No clatter of armor, no trumpet or horse. Just the soft sound of boots on the gravel path and the brief creak of the garden gate as it opened. I was shelling beans on the bench beside the door, my lap full of pods, when I looked up and saw him standing there. He wasn't young, his beard was streaked with gray, and his shoulders sloped with the weariness of someone who had carried more than just a pack. He didn't speak at first, only nodded once, then removed his glove to place a hand to his chest in a gesture I recognized, not quite a bow, but full of respect. I rose and offered him tea, as I do with everyone who finds their way to my door. He didn't refuse. He followed me to the bench beneath the arbor, where the roses were beginning to drop their petals like soft sighs. I poured the tea lavender, lemon balm, and oat straw, and he took it with both hands, fingers rough and calloused, a soldier's hands. He didn't ask for healing, not for wounds. Anyway, there was no blood, no limp, no sign of injury, but he sat very still, like someone who had traveled far and wasn't sure whether to keep going. That kind of stillness doesn't come from the body. It comes from the soul. "I don't need anything," he said, finally. His voice was low, like distant thunder, tired but not bitter. Just some quiet. I nodded and refilled his cup. We sat for a while, the air cooling slowly around us, the light fading. I didn't ask questions. People will speak when they're ready, or they won't. Either way, it is not my task to pull words from them like weeds. My task is to make the ground soft enough for what needs to grow. Eventually, he told me a bit, not of battles or victories, those weren't the stories he brought. He spoke of the silence that came after the noise, of returning to villages burned too quickly, of voices he remembered better than faces. He told me about a child who once placed a flower in the buckle of his armor. "She said it would make me brave," he murmured. "I think it only made me softer." I smiled at that, gently. "Softness isn't weakness," I said. "It's what lets us feel what's worth protecting." He looked at me then, and his eyes were clearer than before. Not bright, just less clouded. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was a bit of dried lavender, a piece of smooth sea glass, and a silver pin shaped like a leaf. "These are things I've carried too long," he said. "I don't know why. They feel like they belong here more than with me." I accepted them with both hands, not to keep, necessarily, but to hold, for a time. Objects carry weight beyond their size. Sometimes, letting someone else carry them, if only for a while, is its own kind of healing. I offered him soup before he left. He accepted, and we sat by the fire, bowls in our hands, the warmth rising gently between us. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The silence was full, not empty, and it comforted us both. When he finally stood to go, he looked taller somehow, not because the weight was gone, but because it had shifted, become something he could carry with a little more ease. "Thank you," he said, "for listening, for not asking." I walked with him to the gate, as I do with all my visitors. The moon had begun to rise, casting silver over the path. He paused there, one hand on the latch, then turned slightly. "You remind me of someone," he said, "someone I never thanked." And then he was gone, boots fading into the hush of night. I stayed by the gate a moment longer, hand resting on the wood, before returning inside. I placed the lavender and the pin on a shelf above the hearth, beside other small things people had left behind. Not trophies, just pieces of their stories, pieces they no longer needed to carry alone. Sometimes kindness is quiet. Sometimes it looks like tea in the evening, or a place to sit without speaking. Sometimes it's just being there, without needing to be anything more. And in that, there is peace. It was tucked beneath the wild mint, hidden so neatly among the morning's harvest that I almost didn't see it. Just a bit of folded paper, yellowed at the edges, with a sprig of dried chamomile tied to it by a length of soft blue thread. I paused there in the garden, my hands still damp with dew, holding the note gently as if it might crumble into dust. The basket had been resting by the gate, same as always, ready for my morning rounds, for collecting rosemary and calendula and the last of the early summer nettle. I hadn't seen anyone leave it. But then again, not all gestures arrive with footsteps. Some come quietly, like a breeze through the trees or the hush of dawn. I sat down on the stone bench beneath the arbor and untied the string with care. The paper creaked softly, worn and old, but still intact. The handwriting inside was careful, a little shaky, as if written by someone who hadn't used ink in some time. I read slowly. "You may not remember me, but I remember you. It was 3 winters ago. I was the girl with the fever. You brought willow bark and a warm poultice and told my mother not to be afraid. I've never forgotten your voice. You said, 'This too shall pass,' like the frost gives way to bloom. And it did. I passed through the worst of it, and I lived. I'm stronger now. I keep bees, I press flowers, and I've started my own little herb patch, just like yours. I learned from watching you. I just wanted to say thank you." There was no name, no signature, just a small drawing at the bottom, a bee hovering over a daisy. I folded the letter again with slow fingers, holding it for a moment against my chest. The chamomile in the string crumbled slightly, releasing a faint, sweet scent that seemed to linger longer than it should. I looked out over the garden, and everything felt still, not in the way of emptiness, but in fullness, the kind of stillness that follows something meaningful. You never truly know how your presence settles in someone else's life. You offer a warm hand, a cup of tea, a bundle of herbs wrapped in muslin, and then they're gone. You return to your own rhythm, your own quiet. You don't ask for thanks. You don't expect to be remembered. But every once in a while, something returns. I thought of that young girl again and tried to picture her now, grown, perhaps taller, sun-browned from time in the garden, her hands smelling of honey and thyme. Maybe she sings to her plants the way I do. Maybe she whispers gratitude to the roots before she gathers them. I like to think so. That afternoon, I made her a gift, not to send, not with expectation, but simply as an echo of the kindness she left for me. A small beeswax candle, rolled with dried chamomile petals, a bundle of lemon balm tied with a silk ribbon, and a note, short and simple. Your words warmed a quiet day. The bee has found her bloom. I placed them all into a little wooden box and set it on my work table. Beside the letter she'd written, I didn't know where to send it, and perhaps it wasn't meant to go anywhere at all. Some offerings are just meant to be made, not delivered. Some kindnesses are for the air, for the spirit, for whatever soft thing inside us carries memory. That evening, the breeze was gentle and warm. I left the door open and sat by the hearth, candle lit, tea steeping beside me. The letter rested nearby, as if keeping watch. I felt no rush to put it away. It could stay there a while. There's something beautiful in being reminded that you matter, even in silence, that the little things the hand held, the fever cooled, the words spoken in passing have roots that stretch far beyond your sight. I added a few more petals to the herb bowl on the mantel, just a few, enough to let the scent of chamomile rise into the evening, mingling with the smoke of the candle and the faint memory of ink on paper. And as the rain began again, just barely tapping at the roof, I whispered softly into the room. Not to anyone in particular. I remember you, too, just beyond the curve of the garden wall, where the blackberry brambles soften and the air begins to smell of moss and stone. A stream runs quietly through the trees. It's not grand or wide, barely more than a ribbon of water weaving its way through the underbrush, but to me, it has always sung, always. I walk there most mornings when the weather allows, basket in hand, shawl pulled around my shoulders. The path is narrow and soft, worn by years of footsteps and the gentle press of time. Birds accompany me from above, fluttering from branch to branch like little guides, their songs blending with the wind through the ash trees. By the time I reach the stream, the world feels far away. Its voice is never the same. In spring, it chatters, bright and playful, bubbling over stones with excitement. In summer, it hums low and slow, stretching lazily under the warm sky. Today, in early autumn, it sang in a hush, soft, steady, like a lullaby whispered just beneath the surface. I knelt on the mossy bank and dipped my fingers into the water. It was cool, with a slight sting that reminded me of early mornings as a child, washing my face in the rain barrel before breakfast. The stream always wakes me up, not just in body, but in spirit. It pulls my thoughts into rhythm, slowing them, centering them, allowing the clutter to float away. I'd come today to gather wild mint and watercress, both of which grow in small patches beside the stream. The mint is sharp and clear, its scent rising as I brush the leaves with the back of my hand. The watercress is more subtle, peppery and crisp, perfect for adding to a midday broth. I pick carefully, never taking more than a third of what's growing, always thanking the earth as I go. As I worked, I heard the stream shift its song, changing slightly, almost as if it were adjusting to my presence. I smiled. It's a quiet companionship, the kind that asks for nothing but offers so much, the kind that stays with you long after you've dried your hands and moved on. Sometimes I bring a book and sit on the flat rock where the stream bends. The rock stays warm from the sun, even when the air is cool. I'll read for a while, but more often I just listen to the water, to the wind, to the small lives all around me. A frog might blink at me from a lily pad. A dragonfly might hover near my hair, humming as it decides whether to land. Today, I stayed longer than usual. There was no rush, no pressing task. I let the stream fill the silence inside me. I watched leaves drift by on the water's surface, brown and gold, and curled at the edges. Tiny boats sailing towards some unseen shore. I reached into the stream and picked up a bit of smooth river stone, its surface slick and dappled with gray and white. I held it in my palm for a long time. There's something comforting in the feel of stone solid, cool, unchanged. I wrapped it in a bit of cloth and tucked it into my pocket, not to keep forever, but to hold for a while. A reminder of stillness. Back at the cottage, I laid the mint and watercress on a cloth by the window to dry slightly. The scent filled the room quickly, clean and green and alive. I poured a cup of tea, just hot water, and a few crushed mint leaves, and sat by the fire, stone still in my pocket, stream still singing in my memory. There are places in the world that heal you without asking, that expect nothing in return. They don't need your story or your sorrow. They just want your presence. The stream is like that. It carries whatever you bring and hums all the while, unchanged and forgiving. Later, I wrote a note in my journal, just a few words. The stream was quieter today. The wind joined in, and beneath that, I sketched a small spiral the way the water had curled around a rock, like a secret being kept. I often think, if anyone were to find my journals years from now, they'd think them strange. No dates, no great events, just herbs and weather and water and light. But to me, they are the story, the real one, the one that matters when all else grows quiet. That evening, just before bed, I placed the stone on the windowsill above the sink. It will stay there for a while, watching the garden, catching the last of the sunlight each day, a little piece of the stream, humming its song into my home. It was a foggy morning when she arrived, the kind of morning where the mist draped itself low over the fields, softening every shape and muffling every sound, as if the world had taken a deep breath and decided to hold it. I'd just stepped out to gather a handful of sage from the garden when I saw her sitting like a shadow on the path near the gate. She was small, sleek, and completely black, her fur glistening with droplets of mist. She didn't move when I approached, just blinked slow and patient and tilted her head slightly, as though I was the one who had arrived at her home. I crouched slowly, careful not to startle her, and said nothing. She didn't run. Instead, she stood, padded up to me, and brushed against my leg with a practiced familiarity, as though this was a routine we'd long shared. I didn't name her, not at first. I've always believed animals come with their own names, and if you're quiet enough, they might share it with you. So I simply called her Little One and left the back door slightly ajar. That night, she curled up on the hearth without invitation, a perfect circle of warmth, purring so softly I could feel it in the floorboards. Days turned into weeks, and she stayed. She explored the cottage like a queen inspecting her court, perched on windowsills, curled among the herb bundles, batting at the twine I used to tie salves. At night, she'd disappear into the shadows, only to return in the morning with wet paws and that same unreadable calm in her yellow eyes. She didn't ask for much, just a bowl of milk left on the step, and a soft place to sleep. In return, she offered presents, not attention, exactly. Just that quiet companionship only animals seem to know how to give. When I worked late into the evening, mixing balms or sorting seeds, she would sit beside me, not watching, just being a little hum of life in the silence. I began to understand her rhythms. She was drawn to lavender and avoided yarrow. She loved lying in the late afternoon sun that pooled beneath the eastern window. When it rained, she would climb onto the highest shelf and press herself close to the wall, as if listening for something I couldn't hear. One afternoon, a visitor came, a young woman from the village who'd heard I made herbal tinctures. She was nervous, her voice thin, her hands fidgeting in her lap. I brewed her a cup of chamomile and lemon balm and invited her to sit. The cat, usually shy with strangers, leapt lightly into the woman's lap and settled there, purring. The woman stilled immediately. Her shoulders dropped, her breathing slowed. She ran her fingers through the cat's fur and smiled a small, quiet smile, but real. I didn't speak for a while. I let the silence do its work, with the soft hum of the cat and the scent of herbs floating through the room. That moment, I realized, was all the healing she'd needed that day. After that, the cat became more than just a companion. She was a keeper of calm, a guardian of peace. I'd find her napping among the jars on the shelf, nestled beside the bundles of dried mint. Sometimes she'd curl up on my journal, forcing me to pause, to rest, to wait until she decided the moment had passed. Eventually, I began to call her Shade, not because of her color, though that was part of it, but because she moved like one, soft, unseen until she chose to be seen, comforting. In that way shadows can be when the light is too bright. She never chased mice, never hunted. She simply existed, and that was enough. She reminded me that presence, in its quietest form, can be a balm, that some healing doesn't come in bottles or teas or tinctures. Sometimes it comes on soft paws, with eyes that understand everything and ask for nothing. Now, when I think of home, I think of Shade curled on the windowsill, her tail twitching ever so slightly in her sleep. I think of the way she follows me from room to room, not because she needs me, but because she chooses to be near. And on foggy mornings, when the world feels soft and uncertain, I remember how she first appeared silent, sure, and entirely her own. And I whisper a quiet thank you, just in case she's listening. The snow began just after sundown. It came without hurry, soft as a lullaby, floating down in great silent flakes that turned the world to velvet. I was just finishing supper, a simple stew of root vegetables and lentils, when I saw the first flake drift past the window, catching the lamplight like a feather. Snow always changes the sound of things. The cottage became quieter, more intimate, as though the walls leaned in closer, and even the fire crackled more gently. I set my bowl aside and pulled on my thick wool shawl, the one my mother knitted many winters ago, its edges worn but still holding warmth. Shade, the cat, lifted her head slightly from her spot by the hearth, but didn't move. She knows snow by scent and by silence and sees no reason to follow it. I stepped outside into the hush. The path to the gate had already begun to disappear, a soft layer of white gently covering the stones and the garden wall. The sky above was a deep indigo, low with clouds, and every breath I took came out as a pale mist that curled into the night. The world smelled of pine and cold and the faint memory of firewood. I walked slowly, my boots crunching lightly with each step, the lantern in my hand casting a soft golden circle of light. I didn't have anywhere to go, not really. I just wanted to feel the snow, to let it fall on my hair, catch on my lashes, kiss the backs of my hands where my mittens had slipped. There's something deeply healing in walking through falling snow with no purpose at all. The village was silent. Lights flickered in a few windows, warm and dim behind frosted panes. Smoke curled from chimneys, and I could almost hear the hush of lullabies being hummed, of chairs rocking gently, of children tucked under patchwork quilts. Snow has a way of slowing everyone down, of pressing pause on worry, of holding us close. I stopped near the well at the center of the village, just beneath the old linden tree. Its bare branches stretched above me like veins against the sky, catching snow in every crook and crevice. Someone, perhaps the baker, had left a lantern on the well's edge, its light flickering behind frosted glass. It felt like a beacon, not just of light, but of memory. I stood there for a while, watching the snow fall in the light, each flake unique, each one melting the moment it touched skin. I thought of years past of winters spent sitting by the hearth with my mother, shelling walnuts and listening to her stories about snowstorms that stranded travelers, about villagers bringing bread and broth to each other in silence, without asking or expecting. That spirit still lives here, in the way neighbors leave baskets on doorsteps, in the way someone always shovels the path to the chapel before dawn, in the way the snow, though cold, seems to warm us to each other. I walked to the edge of the village and looked back at the lights soft and flickering, nestled into the white hills like fireflies sleeping in cupped hands. Then I turned toward home. The path was harder to find now, but I knew it by heart. Each step felt sacred, the kind you take when the world is gone still enough to hear the snow land on your sleeve. I moved slowly, the lantern swinging at my side, its light catching on branches and glinting off icicles that had begun to form beneath the eaves of cottages. When I reached my garden gate, I paused. The cottage looked like a painting, its roof thick with snow, windows glowing warmly, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, I could see Shade stretched on the rug, tail flicking once, as if she'd been listening for my return the whole time. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me with a quiet click. The warmth wrapped around me instantly, scented with pine and dried citrus and something faintly sweet. I peeled off my shawl and set the lantern on the table, watching the last of its flame flicker before I gently snuffed it out. I poured myself a mug of warm milk steeped with nutmeg and cinnamon and sat by the fire, hands wrapped around the cup. Shade joined me, curling beside my feet, purring softly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, cloaking the world in gentle stillness. I didn't speak. I didn't write. I simply sat, letting the warmth and the silence settle into my bones. And in that moment, with snow falling, fire crackling, and the quiet hum of a cat beside me, the world felt whole. Not perfect, not without sorrow, but whole, at the edge of the meadow, past where the herbs grow wild and the grass leans into the breeze like it's listening for something. There stands an old willow tree. She's been there longer than I can remember, longer than most in the village. They say she's been standing in that spot for generations, her roots winding deep into the soil, her branches like arms cradling the sky. I've visited her since I was a child. Back then, she seemed impossibly large, her canopy a green curtain I could disappear beneath, her bark soft and furrowed like the pages of a story written long ago. Even now, when I walk the familiar path past the rosemary thickets and the hedgerows dusted with honeysuckle, I feel a quiet shift as I approach her. The air cools, the sounds hush. It's as though the willow holds its own pocket of time. She stands near a pond that mirrors her branches, where dragonflies skim the surface and frogs croak softly in the reeds. I come here when I need stillness beyond what the cottage walls can offer. Not that my home isn't peaceful, but there's something different about the peace found under the limbs of an old tree. It's older than comfort. It's closer to belonging. I often bring a small blanket, a thermos of warm tea, and my journal. I lean my back against her trunk and let my thoughts wander. The bark is rough but kind, and the way the leaves whisper above me makes it feel like someone is humming a lullaby only I can hear. If you've ever sat beneath a willow, you know it's like being held. Some days, I don't write at all, I just listen. I listen to the breeze combing through the branches, to the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, to the quiet thoughts that rise when nothing is pressing for attention. It's in that silence that the memories come, not always in full, not always clear, but in pieces, like petals drifting on water. I remember sitting there as a girl, my mother beside me, showing me how to tie bundles of herbs with simple twine. I remember crying under that tree once, the kind of heartbreak that seems so big when you're young. I remember a summer day when the whole village gathered in the meadow for the solstice, and children hung ribbons from the willow's limbs while laughter danced through the grass. The willow has seen it all. She holds secrets in her roots, stories in her branches. I sometimes wonder how many tears she's witnessed, how many promises were whispered into her bark, how many dreams floated up into her leaves. There's a gentle sorrow to her, but also an immense strength. She doesn't resist the wind, she bows with it. She doesn't fight time, she weaves it into her rings. One autumn, I scattered the ashes of a dear friend beneath her roots. She had loved this spot too, always sitting with a book, always humming under her breath. I like to think some part of her remains there wrapped in the roots, rising through the branches, glinting in the pond's reflection. Today, I brought a small bundle of lavender and placed it at the base of the tree, just a quiet offering, nothing ceremonial. I touched the trunk and leaned my forehead gently against it, letting my breath slow. The sun filtered through the canopy, warm and golden, catching in the threads of my shawl. There are few places in this world that make you feel like you are entirely where you're meant to be. The willow does that for me. She doesn't need to speak. Her presence says enough. She says, "You've been here before. You're welcome again. Stay as long as you need." As the light faded and the sky shifted from blue to soft rose, I gathered my blanket and tea, gave her one last gentle pat, and made my way back home. Shade was waiting at the door, as always, her tail curled neatly around her paws. The cottage smelled of sage and wood smoke. The kettle began to hum. And though I had left the willow, a part of her had followed me, the hush, the stillness, the sense that I belonged not just somewhere, but here. The harvest moon always arrives quietly, rising large and low above the hills as the day fades into gold and rust. It bathes the fields in a soft, amber light that makes the wheat shimmer and the pumpkins glow like lanterns still asleep. In our village, we don't mark it with loud celebration or grand displays. Instead, we gather gently just as the moon does and share warmth beneath her gaze. Every year, on the night of the harvest moon, I prepare a tea for the gathering. It's a tradition I inherited from my mother, and she from hers, and likely further still, down a line of hands and herbs and silent gratitude. The recipe isn't written anywhere. It lives in memory, in rhythm, in the scent of the cupboard when I open the jars and let my hands choose what feels right. This year, I chose apple peel, cinnamon bark, dried rose hips, and a handful of calendula petals bright and golden, like small sunbursts. I added a whisper of clove and a touch of fennel, not too much, just enough to remind us of sweetness held in the earth. As the kettle warmed, the scent of the blend began to rise, curling into the rafters, making Shade stretch lazily from her perch by the window. I filled a large basket with mugs wrapped in linen and nestled the tea in a thick ceramic pot, still warm from the hearth. Outside, the sky was already deepening, and the moon peaked just above the edge of the ridge, full and watchful. I wrapped myself in my wool cloak and set out, the basket balanced in one arm, lantern in the other. The gathering was simple, just as it always is, a clearing by the old stone wall, where lanterns hung from branches and straw bales made makeshift benches. Children ran barefoot in the grass, their laughter floating into the air like fireflies. Elders sat with blankets over their knees, murmuring stories to anyone who paused long enough to listen. And in the center, a long wooden table held baskets of bread, roasted squash, honeyed apples, and jars of preserves glowing like captured light. I poured the tea slowly, carefully, one cup at a time, passing it into waiting hands. "Thank you," they said, sometimes with their eyes, sometimes with nothing at all but a soft smile. I didn't need the words. I felt them. I sat beside the baker's wife for a while, her hands still dusted with flour, her cheeks pink from the heat of her oven. We sipped in silence, watching the moon climb higher. She spoke only once, to say, "It's been a hard season," and I replied, simply, "You're here. That counts for something." She nodded, and we let the quiet carry the rest. Later, the children brought small paper stars they had made, each tied with string. They hung them from branches so they could spin in the breeze, tiny messages to the moon. One boy handed me a star of my own. "It's for your tea," he said. "Mama says it makes her heart feel calm." I pressed the star gently into my pocket, a little flutter of kindness I'd carry home. As the fire burned lower and the night deepened, the gathering softened. People leaned against one another, a few hummed songs from childhood. Some sat alone, heads tilted toward the moon, eyes closed in thought or memory. The air was crisp, touched with the scent of crushed leaves and cooling earth. When it was time to leave, I packed the basket with the empty mugs, now cradling traces of steam and gratitude. The pot was nearly empty, just enough for one more cup, which I poured for myself when I returned home. I sat on the stone step outside the cottage, the cup warm in my palms, the moon bright above. Shade joined me, pressing against my leg before settling with a sigh at my feet. There's something about the harvest moon that brings things to rest, not in an ending, but in a soft pause, a deep breath before the hush of winter. It asks nothing. It shines on everyone, equally, gently. And in that light, with tea still warming my hands and the scent of apple and rose drifting through the night, I felt full not just with tea or with memory, but with quiet, enduring peace. The midwife's name is Bridget, and though her hands are small and calloused, they carry more stories than most books ever will. She's attended nearly every birth in the village for the past 20 years, and even longer than that, if you count the years she helped her own mother before her. She never married, never left, never asked for much beyond a strong kettle, a clean towel, and a bit of quiet when the work was done. Everyone loves Bridget, and yet, because she's always strong, always certain, always the first to arrive and the last to leave, it's easy to forget that even the strongest hands get tired. So today, I made her a basket. I started early, while the dew still clung to the leaves and the air smelled faintly of moss. I lined the bottom of the basket with soft linen, then walked the garden in slow circles, letting my hands choose what they wanted to offer. Lemon balm for rest, calendula for her skin, a bit of yarrow, always a steady friend, and lavender, of course, lavender for peace. I added a small jar of balm I'd made just yesterday. Its scent a gentle blend of chamomile and beeswax. It's good for sore joints, tired feet, and the kind of weariness that lingers in the bones. I tied a sprig of rosemary to the lid with a blue ribbon. Bridget always wears blue, just a thread of it somewhere, in a shawl or a pin or tucked into her pocket like a secret charm. I tucked in a few slices of honey oat bread, wrapped in cloth, still warm from the oven. She often forgets to eat, or eats only whatever someone puts into her hands between cries and quiet. And tucked beside it all, I placed a note, for the hands that hold new life, and the heart that never asks to be thanked. Rest, even just a little. When the basket was ready, I set out down the path. The air had warmed by then, but the breeze still held that early autumn crispness that nudges the leaves into gold. The walk to Bridget's cottage winds past the church, the pasture, and a small field of chamomile that blooms late, as though it knows someone will need it. Bridget's door was open, as it often is. I called softly and stepped inside. She was there, seated at her table, her feet up on a stool, a pot of tea in front of her, and a look on her face that said she hadn't slept more than a few hours in the past 2 nights. She looked up, and when she saw the basket, she smiled not widely, but the kind of smile that lingers in the eyes. "I was just thinking of you," she said, reaching for the bread with a grateful sigh. We sat for a while. She told me about the baby girl born 2 nights ago, healthy as a summer peach, and the long labor that preceded her. About the mother's tears of relief, the father's trembling hands, the moment of silence before the first cry. She spoke slowly, as if remembering it made her tired and whole all at once. Then she turned to the basket. Her fingers moved through it gently, lifting each item as though it were more than what it seemed. When she found the note, she didn't read it aloud. She didn't have to. She held it in her lap, pressing it between her palms like a prayer. "Everyone brings things to me," she said quietly, "but rarely something just for me." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. We sat in that warm room, the light drifting across the table, the scent of herbs between us. She sipped the tea. She closed her eyes for a moment. The silence that settled there was kind, the kind that says, "I see you. You're allowed to rest." Before I left, she reached into a drawer and handed me a tiny bundle, 2 handkerchiefs, neatly folded, embroidered with lavender. "For when your eyes need soft places," she said. I walked home slowly, the sky now shifting into late afternoon, the sun long and low across the fields. Shade met me at the gate, stretching and winding around my ankles like a ribbon. Back in the cottage, I set the little bundle on my work table and lit a candle beside it. There's a rhythm to giving and receiving, a pulse that moves through us when we choose to care for each other in small, deliberate ways. A basket, a handkerchief, a note. These are the threads that hold a village together, not loud, not bright, but strong. And tonight, as I sit by the fire with the scent of rosemary still clinging to my sleeves, I think of Bridget, her quiet strength, her tired smile, the hands that bring life into the world and then keep going. Even the strongest hands deserve to be held. Some nights, sleep comes easily, the kind of sleep that folds itself around you like a well-worn quilt, gentle and complete. But other nights, well, some nights, dreams tug too tightly at the edges. They wake you before you're ready, or they leave you restless, tangled in thoughts you can't quite name. That's when the dream salve comes out. I've made it for years. It started with a child, a little boy named Edwin, who used to live down the hill with his grandmother. He was quiet, always clinging to her skirts, his eyes full of questions he didn't have the words to ask. She brought him to me one morning, her voice low with worry. "He cries in his sleep," she whispered, "every night, but he won't say why." I looked at him then, sitting small and solemn on the edge of my bench, his hands folded in his lap. And I knew this wasn't the kind of fear you chase away with reason. It needed something softer. So I made the salve. It's a blend of wild-crafted herbs, lavender for peace, mugwort for softened dreams, a touch of chamomile for comfort. I mix them into warm oil, let them steep for days in a sunny corner of the windowsill, and then stir in melted beeswax until the texture is just right thick, smooth, with a slight golden hue. I add a drop of rose and blue tansy, not for their strength, but for their gentleness. The scent is soft, earthy, a little sweet, like a meadow at dusk. I place the finished salve in a small tin with a painted lid, a moon cradled in clouds. I told Edwin's grandmother to rub just a touch on his temples and the soles of his feet before bed, and to light a candle while doing it not for light, but for ritual, for reassurance. A week later, she returned. "He's still dreaming," she said, "but now he smiles in his sleep." Since then, I've kept the salve on hand, not always for children, sometimes for the aging farmer whose wife passed last winter, sometimes for the young mother whose mind races with every cry from the crib, sometimes for myself when the past drifts too near in the quiet hours. It's not magic, not in the sense of spells or potions, but it is magic in the way all care is slow, deliberate, offered with the heart as much as the hands. People often tell me the scent reminds them of something they can't quite place, a memory just out of reach, a moment when they felt safe. That's what I aim for, not to erase the dreams, but to hold them gently, to guide them, to soften the sharp edges and fill in the blank spaces with warmth. Some have taken to making it part of their nightly rhythm. A cup of tea, a soft song, a bit of salve warm between the palms. I always suggest adding a few whispered words not for the herbs, but for yourself. Something like, "I am held," or "Let the night be kind." It doesn't matter the words, really, only that you mean them. I keep my own tin by the bedside, in a small wooden box carved with vines. I don't use it every night, just the ones that feel too heavy. I dab a little beneath my nose, sometimes on my wrists, and then I lie back and listen to the fire sighing in the hearth. The scent takes me to places soft and quiet, meadows I haven't walked in years, voices that once called me little one, skies full of stars I've long since forgotten the names of. Last winter, I made a larger batch and gifted it to every home in the village. I placed the tins in baskets with a sprig of pine and a folded note, for the nights when your mind won't rest. May this help carry you gently. A few people laughed, but most just smiled that slow, grateful kind of smile, the kind that needs no words. Now, when I pass windows at night and see candlelight flickering or catch the scent of lavender drifting from a chimney, I feel a quiet connection, not just to the people, but to their dreams, to the ways we all seek rest, in our own quiet ways. Dreams are wild things. They visit whether we invite them or not. But with a little care, a little softness, we can meet them with open hands rather than fear. And sometimes, that's enough. There are certain evenings when the air inside feels heavy, not from heat or worry, exactly, but from something older, something that doesn't have a name. On those nights, I reach for the bundle of dried herbs tied with jute twine that hangs near the kitchen window. I untie it gently, the way you'd wake a sleeping friend, and light one end over the hearth's fading embers. It catches slowly, curling into itself with a soft hiss before the first ribbons of smoke begin to rise thin, silvery threads that waver through the air like whispers. I move through the cottage slowly, holding the smoldering bundle in one hand, my other hand open behind it, guiding the scent through doorways, across windowsills, into quiet corners. The herbs I burn change with the seasons. In spring, it's often rosemary and birch bark. In summer, sage and lavender. Tonight, with autumn leaning heavy on the wind, I chose mugwort, cedar, and just a touch of thyme. It's not a spell. It's not for show. It's a way of clearing, of acknowledging what has settled that doesn't belong. As the smoke drifts, it weaves around the shelves, brushes the tops of jars, lingers over the chair where I sometimes fall asleep with a book in my lap. I hum a little, not a song really, just a note that rises and falls like breath. The cat follows me, her tail flicking with interest, eyes half closed as she watches the trails I leave behind. Some people ask if I believe the smoke banishes anything. I don't think of it that way. It doesn't force, it invites. It says, you can stay, or you can go. But let's be honest about what no longer serves. There's kindness in that, a release that's not a tearing away, but a letting go. I remember the first time I saw my mother do it. I was young, maybe 6 or 7, sitting cross-legged by the hearth while she moved slowly through the house with a bundle of dried juniper. The smell was sharp, like the edge of winter, and the smoke moved in swirls that made shapes only a child could see. She didn't speak during the ritual, but when she returned to the hearth, she knelt and whispered, "Thank you," to what I never asked, but now I think I know. The smoke finds what's been hidden not to expose it, but to lighten it. It curls into the spaces between thoughts, into the cobwebbed corners of memory. Sometimes it stirs things, old longings, past sorrows, fleeting joy, and sometimes it simply makes room. Tonight, as I move through the cottage, I pass the wooden box on the shelf, the one filled with letters and dried petals and marbles smooth with age. I pause, let the smoke drift around it, and I feel something soften in my chest. A memory. Maybe. A voice from years ago. It doesn't rise fully. It doesn't have to. The recognition alone is enough. When the smoke begins to thin, I place the bundle on the stone plate near the door, where it smolders itself into quiet. The room feels different now, not scrubbed clean, not emptied, but clearer, as though everything inside can breathe again. I sit by the window, cup of nettle tea in hand, and watch the last of the smoke rise into the air like a prayer set free. Outside, the sky has deepened into navy, and a few stars have pushed through the clouds. The night is still, the kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty, but sacred. Shade curls beside me, her breath slow and steady. The scent of herbs still lingers earthy and ancient, familiar in a way that words can't quite reach. I feel lighter, not unburdened entirely, but steadied, grounded. There are many ways to care for a space. Some use broom and soap. Some use music or laughter. I use smoke and silence and gratitude. And when the house has been walked through and the smoke has done its gentle work, I always whisper what my mother once did. Thank you. Not because something left, but because something stayed. There's a bench in my garden that has seen more of me than most people ever will. It's tucked between 2 lavender bushes, set along the southern edge of the garden, where the herbs thin out and the wild grasses begin. It's not polished or elegant, just a sturdy wooden seat, gray with age, the corners rounded by time and weather. But it holds space for me in a way that feels almost sacred. I go there in the evenings, after the day's work is done, when the tools have been cleaned and the fire banked low, with a wool shawl wrapped around my shoulders and a warm mug in my hands. I step out into the cool night and let the quiet lead me. The path glows faintly with moonlight, and my feet know the way without thought. From the bench, the sky opens wide, an ocean of stars overhead, unbroken and endless. It's where I remember to breathe, deeply and fully, as if the air itself is stitched with calm. The scent of the lavender is stronger at night, mixed with the sharp green of thyme and the lingering sweetness of the chamomile nearby. The breeze carries it all in soft, familiar waves. Shade often follows me, her black fur like liquid shadow. She leaps onto the bench beside me or curls beneath it in the grass, her eyes catching just enough starlight to glow faintly. We sit together, the way 2 souls do when words aren't needed. When the silence is enough, on clear nights, the stars come in layers first, the bright, steady ones that arrive with the moon. then the smaller, more tentative ones that slowly gather as the sky deepens. I tilt my head back and let my gaze wander among them, not naming, not counting, just watching, just feeling the vastness stretch and settle inside me. Sometimes I hum, soft and low, the kind of tune with no real melody but all the comfort of a lullaby. Other times, I whisper thoughts into the air, not prayers exactly, but wishes, maybe, hopes sent quietly into the sky, knowing that the stars will keep them safe. I've spent countless nights on that bench, some joyful, some weary, some simply still. I've watched fireflies blink like tiny lanterns in the tall grass, listened to owls call from the edge of the woods, traced the slow path of the moon across the horizon. I've held warm cups of spiced milk, and once or twice, a tear that I didn't know was waiting to fall. The bench asks for nothing. It doesn't judge or hurry. It holds me just as I am, and in that, there's a kind of healing that's hard to find elsewhere. Tonight, the stars are especially bright, scattered thick like handfuls of salt over dark velvet. I see Orion's belt, the curve of Cassiopeia, the faint shimmer of a satellite tracing its quiet course. The wind rustles the leaves above me, a soft hush that matches the breath of the earth. Everything feels slow and alive. I take a sip from my mug, lemon verbena, and honey, and close my eyes for a moment. The warmth fills my chest, and I feel rooted, not just to the ground beneath me, but to this life, this quiet, steady life I've chosen. It's not always simple, not always easy, but it is mine, built with my hands, tended with my heart, woven with these soft, still nights. Before I leave the bench, I often place a hand on the wood beside me, a simple gesture, a thank you, an acknowledgement of the comfort it gives. Back inside, the cottage welcomes me with its familiar hush, the soft scent of dried herbs, the glow of candlelight flickering low. Shade trots in behind me, leaps onto her cushion by the hearth, and curls into a purring crescent. I remove my shawl, set my mug by the sink, and pause once more at the window. Outside, the stars still shine. And I know, tomorrow night, the bench will be waiting just where it always is, just the way I need it to be. It was a morning like any other, soft sunlight just beginning to pour through the cottage windows, the smell of toast and wild plum jam in the air, a gentle hum from the kettle warming over the hearth. Shade had already claimed her favorite sunlit corner, stretched long and content, while I moved quietly about my routines. There was no reason to expect anything unusual, but then I saw it, a bundle left on the doorstep, not large, no more than the size of a small bread loaf, wrapped in linen as pale as cream and tied with a length of hand-dyed ribbon the color of heather bloom. No note, no name, just sitting there in the early light, the kind of surprise that feels more like a whisper than a knock. I stepped outside, the stone still cool beneath my feet, and looked up and down the path. No footprints, no sign of who had left it, only bird song in the hedgerow and the distant sound of the stream beyond the garden. I bent slowly, lifting the bundle into my hands. It was light, but not empty. Inside, I laid it on the table and carefully untied the ribbon, smoothing it between my fingers before folding it aside. The linen was soft and worn, the edges stitched with small, even marks someone had taken care, not just in wrapping, but in making. Within the folds, tucked in like treasure, I found 3 things. First, a bundle of dried herbs I hadn't grown myself, mountain savory, pine needles, and something I didn't immediately recognize. It smelled sharp and resinous, like hillside breezes and long-forgotten pine forests. I held it to my nose, breathing in slowly, and felt something shift in my chest, a memory not quite mine, yet somehow familiar. Second, a hand-carved charm, small, no larger than a coin, shaped like a crescent moon cradled by leaves. It was made of dark wood, polished smooth by years of touch. The grain shimmered faintly when it caught the light, as though the tree it came from still remembered sunlight. I turned it over and over in my palm, feeling its quiet weight. And last, a piece of parchment, not written on, but pressed with petals. 4 of them, pale blue, perfectly preserved, as if gathered just yesterday. They had been arranged in the shape of a windrose, delicate and precise. Whoever had made it had hands as patient as the earth itself. I sat with the bundle for a long time, touched by the stillness it brought with it. There are gifts that arrive with ceremony wrapped in ribbon, offered with words, and then there are the others, the ones that appear like a breath of wind, carrying meaning without instruction, intimacy without demand. I didn't know who had left it. I still don't. But I felt, deep in the marrow of me, that it was someone who had seen me perhaps from a distance, perhaps from a single meeting years ago, and understood what would matter. Not a grand gesture, just a kindness, just a moment of connection. I placed the charm above the hearth, nestled between my favorite jars, the ones with elderflower and dried lemon peel. The pressed petal parchment found its home tucked inside my journal, where it could wait to be remembered again. And the herbs I used that evening. I ground them carefully in my mortar, adding a pinch of lavender and a twist of orange peel, and blended them into a tea meant not for sleep, nor for healing, but simply for presence, for grounding, for opening the senses. As I poured the water, the scent filled the cottage, unexpected and bright, like a song hummed on a day without rain. I sipped it slowly on the bench beneath the arbor, the cup warm in my hands, the garden buzzing softly with late bees and the lazy hum of dusk. The breeze stirred the lavender, and the petals on the roses had begun to fall. Everything felt full of time, of meaning, of something just beyond the edges of understanding. That night, I wrote in my journal. Today, I was reminded that some messages are left not in ink, but in scent, in shape, in silence. Whoever you are, I felt your care, and I will carry it. Not all gifts come wrapped in answers. Some come only to remind us we are part of something larger, woven together by threads we don't always see, held quietly by people we may never know. And sometimes, that's enough. The longest night of the year arrives not with fanfare, but with a hush. It slides quietly across the sky, soft as velvet, stretching the hours of darkness into something deep and full. In our village, we don't fear it. We welcome it with quiet lights, shared bread, and the warmth of stories told by firelight. The morning began slow and pale. A faint frost clung to the edges of the windows, tracing delicate ferns across the glass. The garden lay still beneath a light dusting of snow, the herbs asleep in their beds, dreaming of spring. I stepped out just long enough to gather kindling and one last bundle of dried pine I'd kept aside for this very evening. Inside, I built the fire deliberately, a ritual in itself, stacking logs with care, tucking dried herbs and curls of birch bark beneath, whispering a simple wish as I struck the flint. Let warmth find every corner tonight. The flames rose easily, crackling with gentle promise, and the room glowed gold. The hearth is never brighter than on the longest night. It seems to understand the balance it must hold the fire inside, rising to meet the darkness beyond. I sat close, stirring a pot of lentil and barley stew, its scent rich and grounding. I added thyme, a bay leaf, and just a touch of pepper, a meal for comfort, for reflection, for sharing. Throughout the day, neighbors stopped by one, not for long, just a cup of spiced cider, a bite of gingerbread, a brief moment near the fire. Tom brought a bundle of wool, freshly spun. Elsie arrived with a jar of cranberry jam. Even quiet Bridget paused to drop off a hand-stitched sachet of dried rose petals and cedar. To sweeten your dreams, she said, with a wink. Shade remained curled by the fire, her tail twitching in sleep, purring like a distant drumbeat. Outside, the wind picked up, swirling snow into tiny spirals that danced briefly before disappearing. The world was cold, but here, inside, warmth reigned. As evening fell, I lit the candles, one for each window, each table, each shelf that wanted light. Not too many, just enough to remind the shadows they were not alone. I set out extra blankets, a tray of sliced fruit, and placed a small bowl of salt by the door, a tradition my grandmother taught me to bless those who pass through. When the final knock came, it wasn't a person. It was the wind itself, rattling gently at the shutter, as if asking to be let in for a moment of warmth. I smiled and laid another log on the fire, letting the sparks rise and curl into the chimney like tiny stars returning home. Later, when the house had quieted and the candles had burned low, I sat by the hearth with a fresh cup of tea, mugwort and cinnamon, a blend for deep dreaming. I watched the flames sway and flicker, casting shadows that danced across the walls like old friends. The fire popped softly, and I wrapped my shawl tighter, letting the warmth seep into my bones. This night is long, yes, but it is also beautiful. It asks us to slow, to remember, to gather not in brightness, but in glow. It reminds us that even in the deepest dark, something always holds light, a hearth, a candle, a heart that chooses to remain soft. And as I sat there, in the golden silence of the longest night, I felt the whole of the year settle around me, all its small joys, its quiet griefs, its ordinary magic. I breathed it in and let it go. Tomorrow, the light will begin to return, but tonight, we honor the stillness. Tonight, we sit by the fire and rest,